I'm Maya, 26 years old, and my father almost killed my premature baby to charge my sister's phone. Yes, you heard that right. He unplugged my daughter's life support equipment so my spoiled sister could scroll through TikTok. My 2-pound miracle baby stopped breathing, turned blue, and suffered brain damage because he thought a phone was more important than his granddaughter's life. When I confronted him, he called me paranoid and defended my sister instead of apologizing. But here's what he didn't know. I'm not the same broken girl he used to walk all over. I spent months planning the perfect revenge, and by the time I was done, both he and my sister lost everything they cared about. Their reputations, their money, their future, gone. And the final twist? The real reason he always chose her over me will shock you to your core. This is my story of revenge, and trust me, it was worth every second. Have you ever trusted the wrong person? Tell me in the comments. My name is Maya, and 3 months ago, my world changed forever when I gave birth to Emma at just 28 weeks. Most people don't understand what it means to have a micro-preemie until they're living it. Emma weighed exactly 2 pounds and 3 ounces when she entered this world, so tiny that my wedding ring could slide up her entire arm. The doctors weren't sure she'd survive the first night, but my little fighter proved them all wrong. The NICU became my second home, and honestly, I spent more time there than in my actual apartment. Those sterile white walls, the constant beeping of monitors, the smell of hand sanitizer, it all became strangely comforting because it meant Emma was still alive. I learned to read every machine, every number on those screens. The ventilator that helped her breathe, the feeding tube that gave her nutrition, the heart monitor that tracked every precious beat, and the oxygen saturation monitor that became my biggest source of anxiety and relief. I remember the first time I was allowed to hold her for skin-to-skin contact. She was so small, so fragile, covered in wires and tubes. The nurses had to help me position her just right so none of the equipment would get disconnected. I was terrified I'd hurt her just by breathing wrong. But feeling her tiny body against my chest, seeing her relax into my warmth, that's when I knew I'd do absolutely anything to protect this little person. The NICU staff became like family to me. Nurse Jennifer always made sure I ate something during my 12-hour visits, and Dr. Peterson explained every procedure with such patience, never making me feel stupid for asking the same questions over and over. They understood that Emma wasn't just another case file to me. She was everything. They saw me cry when her oxygen levels dropped, and they celebrated with me when she gained her first ounce. My boyfriend Marcus tried to be supportive, but the stress was overwhelming for both of us. He'd visit for an hour after work, but I could see the fear in his eyes every time he looked at Emma. He'd hold my hand and tell me everything would be okay, but I knew he was struggling too. The financial strain was incredible. Even with insurance, the medical bills were piling up, and I'd used up all my maternity leave just sitting in that hospital chair. The hardest part was watching other families come and go. Babies born weeks after Emma would graduate to regular nurseries while we remained in the critical care unit. Some families received devastating news that I couldn't bear to witness, and others got to take their babies home while Emma continued fighting for every breath. The NICU is a place where miracles and heartbreak exist side by side, separated only by thin curtain dividers. After 2.5 months, Emma finally reached 4 pounds and could breathe without the ventilator. The doctor said she could come home with portable equipment, an oxygen monitor, a feeding pump, and an apnea machine that would alert us if she stopped breathing. I was terrified and excited at the same time. Home meant normal life, family dinners, and introducing Emma to her grandfather and aunt who'd been waiting to meet her. I spent weeks learning how to operate all the equipment, memorizing emergency procedures, and baby-proofing my apartment for a child who needed medical-grade care. The discharge planner went over everything multiple times, emphasizing how critical it was that Emma's equipment stay plugged in and functional at all times. One malfunction, one power outage, one unplugged cord could be life-threatening for a baby whose lungs were still developing. Finally, discharge day arrived, and I carefully buckled Emma into her car seat, surrounded by machines that would keep her safe at home. The first week at home with Emma was exhausting but beautiful. Every night, I'd wake up multiple times just to check her breathing, even though the monitors were doing that job. Marcus helped when he could, but he was working overtime to cover our medical expenses, so most days it was just Emma and me in our quiet apartment. I was finally starting to feel like we might actually have a normal life when my sister Jessica announced she was coming home from college for spring break. Jessica had always been the golden child in our family. while I worked part-time jobs through high school and took out student loans for community college. Dad paid for Jessica's entire university experience at an expensive private school 3 states away. She studied communications with a minor in social media marketing, which basically meant she spent 4 years learning how to make better Instagram posts. Dad called it investing in her future, but I called it enabling her laziness. The moment Jessica walked through Dad's front door with her designer luggage and fresh highlights, the entire family dynamic shifted back to revolving around her. She'd been gone for 8 months, but within hours, Dad was running to the grocery store to buy her favorite snacks and rearranging his work schedule to spend time with her. When I brought Emma over for dinner that first night, Jessica barely glanced at her niece before launching into stories about her sorority drama and spring break plans in Cabo. Dad hung on every word Jessica said like she was delivering breaking news. She complained about her roommate, her professors, and how hard her classes were, while Dad nodded sympathetically and offered to send her extra money for stress shopping. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there with my 3-month-old preemie who just got out of the NICU, and Dad asked me exactly one question about how Emma was doing before turning his attention back to Jessica's tales of college parties. What really bothered me was how Jessica acted around Emma's medical equipment. She'd wrinkle her nose at the oxygen tubes and make comments about how all the wires and machines made the room look like a hospital. She complained that the humming of Emma's feeding pump was annoying and asked if I could turn it off during dinner. When I explained that Emma needed these machines to survive, Jessica just shrugged and said it was intense before changing the subject back to herself. The worst part was watching Dad enable Jessica's selfishness. When she ran up a $300 phone bill from calling her friends back at school, Dad paid it without question. When she crashed his car backing out of the driveway because she was texting, Dad's first concern was making sure she wasn't upset about the scratches. He took the car to get repaired immediately and let Jessica drive his newer vehicle while hers was in the shop. I tried talking to Dad about the obvious favoritism, but he always had excuses. Jessica was under stress from college. Jessica was young and still figuring things out. Jessica needed support during this difficult transition period. It was like I was watching the same patterns from our childhood play out all over again, except now I had Emma to protect from the toxic family dynamics I'd grown up with. By the end of Jessica's first week home, I'd already decided to limit Emma's exposure to family gatherings. The stress wasn't good for either of us, and I didn't want Emma growing up thinking it was normal for one person to demand constant attention while everyone else's needs got ignored. I figured Jessica would go back to school soon, and things would settle down. I had no idea that her visit home was about to become the catalyst for the worst decision my father would ever make. 3 weeks into Jessica's spring break visit, I was starting to feel comfortable with Emma's home routine. Her feeding schedule was predictable, she was gaining weight steadily, and the doctors were optimistic about weaning her off some of the equipment within a few months. Marcus had taken the afternoon off work to help me reorganize Emma's nursery, and we'd spent the morning installing new shelves for all her medical supplies. Emma had just finished her noon feeding and drifted off to sleep in her crib, surrounded by the gentle hum of her machines. The oxygen monitor showed steady levels, her feeding pump was cycling properly, and the apnea alarm was functioning perfectly. I kissed her tiny forehead and tiptoed out of the room, leaving the door cracked open so I could hear any alerts from the hallway. Dad had offered to stop by and help Marcus install a ceiling fan in our bedroom, something we'd been putting off for weeks. I was grateful for the help, especially since Marcus wasn't particularly handy with electrical work. The 3 of us spent about an hour working on the installation, with the bedroom door closed to contain the dust and noise that might wake Emma. When we finished, I went to check on Emma for her 2 p.m. medication dose. That's when I found my father in her nursery, crouched behind Emma's crib with his phone charger in hand. The oxygen monitor that was supposed to be plugged into the wall outlet behind the crib was sitting unplugged on the floor, its screen dark and silent. In its place, Jessica's phone was charging, displaying her lock screen photo of herself in a bikini. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Dad looked up at me with this casual expression like he was just tidying up the room. He held up the charger and said, "Jessica's phone died and this was the only outlet back here. The baby's sleeping anyway, so I figured it wouldn't matter for a few minutes." I stared at him, waiting for him to realize what he'd just said. The oxygen monitor wasn't just some random piece of equipment. It was literally keeping track of whether Emma was breathing. If her oxygen levels dropped or if she stopped breathing entirely, we'd have no way of knowing without the alarm. Emma was a micro-preemie whose lungs were still developing. She could stop breathing in her sleep, and we might not notice until it was too late. "Dad, that monitor has to stay plugged in," I said, my voice shaky as I rushed to unplug Jessica's phone and reconnect Emma's equipment. "The doctors told us never to unplug any of her machines. Never." He stood up slowly, looking annoyed rather than apologetic. "Maya, you're being paranoid. I was only going to charge her phone for 10 minutes. The baby is fine. Look at her." He gestured toward Emma's crib, where she appeared to be sleeping peacefully. But as the oxygen monitor powered back on and began reading her levels, my heart stopped. Emma's oxygen saturation was at 84% and dropping. Normal levels should be between 95 and 100% for any baby, but especially critical for a preemie like Emma. The machine started beeping frantically as her numbers continued falling. I looked into the crib and saw Emma's lips had a slight blue tinge. Her chest wasn't rising and falling like it should be. She wasn't just sleeping, she had stopped breathing. And without the monitor's alarm, we never would have known. My hands were shaking as I gently stimulated her chest, a technique the NICU nurses had taught me for exactly this situation. Emma gasped and started breathing again, her color slowly returning to normal as her oxygen levels climbed back up. The whole episode probably lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. I scooped her up and held her against my chest, feeling her heartbeat against mine. Dad was still standing there, watching this life-or-death situation unfold like it was mildly interesting television. "Call 911, I told Dad, my voice barely above a whisper as I held Emma against my chest. Her breathing was still shallow and irregular, and I could feel how fast her tiny heart was beating. The oxygen monitor was beeping steadily now, showing her levels climbing back to safer numbers. But I wasn't taking any chances. Dad didn't move. He just stood there staring at us with this confused expression, like he couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of the situation. "Maya, she's breathing now. Look, she's fine. You don't need to call anyone." "She stopped breathing, Dad," I shouted louder than I'd ever raised my voice at him. "She could have brain damage. She could have died. Call 911 right now." Marcus appeared in the doorway, having heard my yelling from the bedroom. He took one look at the scene, me crying and holding Emma, the unplugged monitor, Jessica's phone still connected to the charger, and immediately understood what had happened. He pulled out his phone and dialed without hesitation. While Marcus talked to the 911 operator, I tried to explain to Dad exactly what his actions could have cost us. Emma was born at 28 weeks, which meant her respiratory system was still immature. Preemies like her could experience apnea episodes where they simply stopped breathing for no apparent reason. The monitors weren't optional equipment, they were literally life support systems designed to catch these episodes before they became fatal. Dad kept interrupting me with dismissive comments. "You're overreacting, Maya. Babies have been sleeping without machines for thousands of years." When I mentioned brain damage from oxygen deprivation, he rolled his eyes and said I'd been reading too much on the internet. When I explained that Emma could have died, he actually laughed and told me I was being dramatic. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, but it felt like hours. They immediately began assessing Emma's condition, checking her oxygen levels, listening to her heart and lungs, and asking detailed questions about what had happened. When I explained that Emma had stopped breathing after her monitor was unplugged, they exchanged serious looks and began preparing to transport her back to the hospital. "We need to take her in for observation," the lead paramedic explained. "Any apnea episode in a preemie this young requires immediate evaluation. Even if she seems fine now, there could be complications we can't detect here." As they loaded Emma into the ambulance, Dad finally seemed to grasp the severity of what had happened. But instead of apologizing or taking responsibility, he started making excuses. He told the paramedics that I was a nervous first-time mother who panicked over everything. He suggested that Emma's breathing issues might be related to my anxiety affecting her somehow. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even with Emma being rushed back to the NICU, even with medical professionals treating this as a serious emergency, Dad was still trying to make this about my supposed overreaction rather than his dangerous decision. At the hospital, Dr. Peterson met us in the emergency department. She examined Emma thoroughly and ordered a complete workup, including chest x-rays, blood tests, and continuous monitoring. While we waited for results, she pulled me aside to ask exactly what had happened at home. When I finished explaining about the unplugged monitor and Dad's reasoning, Dr. Peterson's expression grew very serious. Maya, you need to understand that what happened today could have been fatal. Preemies Emma's age can experience sudden apnea episodes, and without immediate intervention, the lack of oxygen can cause permanent brain damage or death within minutes. She continued, the fact that you found her when you did and stimulated her breathing probably saved her life. If that monitor had been unplugged for much longer, or if you hadn't checked on her exactly when you did, we might be having a very different conversation right now. The reality of how close we'd come to losing Emma hit me like a physical blow. Emma was admitted to the NICU for 48-hour observation, and every hour that passed felt like torture. The doctors ran continuous monitoring to check for any signs of brain damage from the oxygen deprivation episode. Marcus stayed with me through the first night, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside Emma's isolette while I watched every number on her monitors with obsessive attention. The next afternoon, Dad showed up at the hospital with Jessica in tow. I was sitting beside Emma's bed, holding her tiny hand through the isolette opening, when I heard Jessica's voice echoing down the hallway. She was complaining loudly about having to come to the hospital instead of going shopping, saying the smell of disinfectant was giving her a headache. When they walked into Emma's room, Dad immediately started with his defensive routine. Maya, I talked to my buddy Tom, and he said his grandson was born early too, and they never had any of this fancy equipment. Kids are tougher than you think. I stared at him in disbelief. We were literally sitting in the NICU where Emma was being monitored for potential brain damage caused by his actions, and he was citing his friend's anecdotal evidence as medical expertise. Jessica stood behind him, scrolling through her phone and looking bored. Dad, the doctors confirmed that Emma stopped breathing because you unplugged her monitor, I said, keeping my voice low because we were in a hospital. Dr. Peterson said she could have died if I hadn't found her when I did. He waved his hand dismissively. Doctors always overreact to cover themselves legally. Look at her. She's fine. You're letting these people scare you into thinking every little thing is a catastrophe. Jessica finally looked up from her phone. Maya, you've always been dramatic about everything. Remember when we were kids and you thought every headache was a brain tumor? This is just more of the same anxiety stuff. I couldn't believe my sister was comparing my childhood hypochondria to a medical emergency involving my newborn daughter. But what Dad said next made me realize just how deep his delusion ran. Jessica's right. You've been obsessed with worst-case scenarios since Emma was born. Maybe spending so much time in this place has made you paranoid. He gestured around the NICU like it was some kind of anxiety-inducing trap rather than the medical facility that had saved Emma's life multiple times. And Jessica needed her phone, he continued, his voice taking on that defensive tone he used whenever anyone criticized his golden child. She was waiting for important information about her summer internship applications. Some things can't wait, Maya. I felt something snap inside me. Her phone was more important than Emma's life? Don't be ridiculous, Dad said, but his tone suggested he actually believed Jessica's phone was more important. It was 10 minutes, Maya. 10 minutes to help your sister with something that could affect her entire future. Jessica nodded along, adding, plus, I told Dad the baby was sleeping anyway. It's not like she was using the machine while she was asleep. The sheer ignorance of that statement left me speechless. These two people, who were supposed to love and protect Emma, genuinely believed that life support equipment was optional as long as the baby appeared to be sleeping peacefully. Dr. Peterson chose that moment to enter the room with Emma's test results. She greeted Dad and Jessica politely, then turned to me with a serious expression. Maya, I have Emma's MRI results. The good news is that we don't see any obvious signs of brain damage from yesterday's episode. However, we did find some concerning changes in her lung development that suggest she experienced significant oxygen stress. She continued, We're going to need to keep Emma on more intensive monitoring for the next few weeks, and she'll likely need respiratory therapy to help strengthen her lungs. This setback has definitely impacted her recovery timeline. Dad actually had the audacity to ask Dr. Peterson if she thought I was overreacting to the situation. Dr. Peterson's response to Dad's question was professional but firm. Sir, what happened to Emma yesterday was a serious medical emergency. Any interruption to a premature infant's respiratory monitoring can be life-threatening. Maya's concern is not only appropriate but necessary for Emma's safety. Dad's face flushed red, but instead of accepting the medical professional's assessment, he doubled down. Well, I still think everyone's making too big a deal out of this. Babies are resilient. After Dr. Peterson left, I thought maybe the reality of Emma's setback would make Dad and Jessica understand the gravity of what had happened. Instead, Jessica pulled out her phone and started taking selfies in the NICU waiting area, posting them to her Instagram story with captions like, "Family emergency but staying strong and hospital visits are so draining." I watched in horror as she turned Emma's medical crisis into social media content. She didn't ask permission to photograph Emma or even acknowledge that this was a private family matter. She just treated the whole situation like another opportunity to get sympathy and attention from her online followers. When I asked her to stop posting about Emma's medical issues, Jessica rolled her eyes. "Maya, you're being controlling. I'm just updating people who care about our family. Besides, it's not like I'm posting anything bad." "You're exploiting my daughter's medical emergency for Instagram likes," I said, my voice getting louder despite being in a hospital. Dad immediately jumped to Jessica's defense. "Maya, your sister is just trying to keep family and friends informed. You're reading too much into everything again." That's when I realized nothing would ever change. Emma could have died because of Dad's decision to prioritize Jessica's phone over his granddaughter's life support equipment, and he was still defending Jessica's behavior. Even worse, Jessica was treating Emma's brush with death like content for her social media brand. Over the next 2 days, while Emma recovered in the NICU, I watched Dad and Jessica's behavior with growing disgust. Dad brought Jessica expensive coffee drinks and her favorite takeout meals while she complained about being bored at the hospital. When other families in the NICU were dealing with their own crises, Jessica would make loud comments about how depressing the environment was and how she couldn't wait to leave. The final straw came when Jessica started live streaming from the hospital parking lot, telling her followers about the crazy drama with Emma's breathing episode. She described it like it was some minor inconvenience that had interrupted her spring break plans, completely minimizing the fact that Emma had stopped breathing and could have suffered permanent brain damage. In her live stream, Jessica actually said, "My sister is super paranoid about every little thing with the baby, so we ended up spending like 2 days at the hospital over basically nothing. The doctors said she's fine, but Maya wanted to do all these extra tests just to be safe." Hearing my daughter's medical emergency described as basically nothing by the person whose phone had nearly cost Emma her life was the moment I knew I was done with my family's dysfunction. This wasn't just about favoritism or Jessica's spoiled behavior anymore. This was about Emma's safety and my ability to protect her from people who had proven they would put their own convenience above her life. I made a decision that night as I sat beside Emma's hospital bed. I was going to remove Dad and Jessica from our lives completely, and I was going to make sure they understood exactly what their actions had cost. Emma deserved better than relatives who saw her as an inconvenience, and I deserved better than a family who dismissed my legitimate concerns as paranoia. Marcus found me crying in the hospital bathroom at 2 a.m., and when I told him what I was planning, he didn't try to talk me out of it. He just held me and said, "Whatever you need to do to protect Emma, I'll support you." I started planning my revenge that very night. The week after Emma came home from her second NICU stay, I began what I called my research phase. While Emma napped and Marcus was at work, I started digging into every aspect of Dad and Jessica's lives. If I was going to remove them from our world permanently, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with and what leverage I had. I started with social media, creating fake accounts to monitor Jessica's posts without her knowing I was watching. What I discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. Jessica had been posting regularly about her stressful family situation and how dramatic I was being about Emma's health issues. She'd created an entire narrative where she was the victim of an unreasonable sister who was making everyone's life difficult with unnecessary medical anxiety. Her followers ate it up, sending sympathy messages and validating her version of events. She never mentioned that Emma was a micro-preemie who needed life support equipment, or that her phone had been charging in place of Emma's oxygen monitor when the breathing episode occurred. Instead, she painted herself as a caring aunt who was being unfairly blamed for a routine baby health scare. But Jessica's social media revealed more than just her narcissistic tendencies. She was posting photos from expensive restaurants, designer shopping trips, and luxury spa days that seemed way beyond what a college student should be able to afford, even with Dad's support. Her spring break trip to Cabo had cost at least $5,000 based on the resort and activities she'd documented. That led me to start investigating Dad's finances. I knew he worked as a senior accountant at a mid-sized construction company, and while he made decent money, it shouldn't have been enough to fund Jessica's extravagant lifestyle while also maintaining his own household. I started paying attention to his spending patterns and noticed some interesting inconsistencies. Dad had always claimed he couldn't help me with Emma's medical expenses because money was tight, but somehow he'd managed to buy Jessica a brand new SUV for her 20th birthday last year. He complained about his mortgage payments whenever I asked for help with anything, but Jessica's credit card bills were getting paid without question. Something didn't add up. I reached out to my friend Kelly, who worked in banking, and asked her some hypothetical questions about detecting financial irregularities. She explained how people sometimes used their access to company accounts to fund personal expenses, and how those kinds of schemes usually left paper trails if you knew what to look for. Using my old laptop, I started researching Dad's employer and their financial reporting. As a public construction company, they had to file certain documents that gave insights into their accounting practices and oversight procedures. I also looked up news articles about embezzlement cases at similar companies to understand common patterns. What really broke the case open was Jessica herself. During one of her Instagram live sessions, she made an offhand comment about Dad getting her a special credit card that didn't have a limit because he had connections at work. She laughed about how convenient it was that she never had to worry about being declined when shopping. That comment made me realize Dad might not just be supporting Jessica with his own money. He might be using company resources to fund her lifestyle. A special credit card with no limits that was connected to his work relationships sounded a lot like a company card being used for personal expenses. I spent the next few days documenting everything I'd found. Jessica's expensive purchases with timestamps, Dad's inconsistent explanations about his financial situation, and his company's policies about employee expense accounts. I also started recording our phone conversations, which was legal in our state as long as one party consented. The picture that emerged was of a man who was embezzling money from his employer to maintain his daughter's expensive lifestyle while claiming he couldn't afford to help with his granddaughter's medical needs. But I needed more concrete evidence before I could act on what I'd discovered. I was going to get that evidence no matter how long it took. 2 weeks into my investigation, I had enough preliminary evidence to seek professional help. I scheduled a consultation with Sarah Martinez, a family law attorney who specialized in child endangerment cases. I'd found her through online reviews from other parents who dealt with similar situations, and her initial phone screening convinced me she'd take my case seriously. Attorney Martinez listened to my story without interruption, taking detailed notes as I explained the oxygen monitor incident, Dad's dismissive reaction, and Emma's subsequent medical setback. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Maya, what your father did meets the legal definition of child endangerment in our state, she said. Knowingly disconnecting life support equipment from a medically fragile infant, even temporarily, could result in criminal charges. The fact that Emma actually stopped breathing and required emergency medical care makes this a very strong case. She explained that I had several legal options available. I could file for a restraining order to keep Dad away from Emma, report the incident to Child Protective Services to create an official record, or pursue criminal charges through the district attorney's office. Each option had different implications and timelines. However, she continued, I need to warn you that family court cases can get messy, especially when there's this level of denial from the other party. Your father will likely claim it was an innocent mistake, and your sister might testify on his behalf. We need to be prepared for a fight. That's when I showed her the recordings I'd been making of my conversations with Dad and Jessica. Attorney Martinez reviewed the transcripts where Dad repeatedly dismissed Emma's medical needs and called me paranoid for following doctor's orders. She was particularly interested in Jessica's social media posts minimizing Emma's breathing episode. "This is excellent documentation," she said. "It shows a pattern of dismissive behavior and lack of understanding about Emma's medical condition. Courts take these cases very seriously when there's evidence that the endangering party doesn't acknowledge the severity of their actions." I also mentioned my suspicions about Dad's financial irregularities, and Attorney Martinez referred me to a colleague who specialized in white-collar crime. "If your father is embezzling money while claiming he can't help with medical expenses for his granddaughter, that could be relevant to establishing his character and priorities in a family court setting." The second attorney, David Chen, agreed to meet with me the following week. I spent the time between appointments gathering more evidence of Dad's suspicious spending patterns. I documented Jessica's expensive purchases against the timeline of Dad's claims about financial hardship, and I researched his company's employee handbook to understand their policies about expense accounts and company credit cards. During my meeting with Attorney Chen, I laid out everything I discovered about Dad's finances. He explained that proving embezzlement would require access to company records that I couldn't obtain on my own, but he could guide me through the process of reporting suspected fraud to the appropriate authorities. Companies take embezzlement very seriously, especially in the construction industry where there's already heavy regulatory oversight, he said. If your father is using company funds for personal expenses, an internal investigation would likely uncover the evidence we need. He also explained that I could report suspected fraud anonymously, which would protect me from any potential retaliation while still triggering an investigation. The key was providing enough specific information to make the company take the complaint seriously. Both attorneys emphasized that I needed to be absolutely certain about my decision to move forward. Once I filed legal complaints or reported suspected crimes, there would be no going back. My relationship with Dad and Jessica would be permanently severed, and the legal process could take months or even years to resolve. I told them I was certain Emma's safety was more important than maintaining relationships with people who had proven they would endanger her life for their own convenience. I scheduled follow-up appointments with both attorneys and left their offices feeling empowered for the first time since the oxygen monitor incident. Armed with legal guidance and documented evidence, I was ready to begin my systematic dismantling of Dad and Jessica's comfortable lives. I decided to start with the restraining order, since Emma's immediate safety was my top priority. Attorney Martinez had prepared all the necessary paperwork, and we had a court date scheduled for the following Friday. The night before the hearing, I practiced my testimony with Marcus. We went over every detail of the oxygen monitor incident, Emma's medical history, and Dad's pattern of dismissive behavior afterward. Marcus helped me organize the evidence binders that Attorney Martinez had prepared, including photos of Emma's equipment, hospital records from her breathing episode, and transcripts of Dad's recorded comments. I barely slept that night, knowing that filing the restraining order would be a point of no return. Once the legal system got involved, there would be no pretending this was just a family disagreement that could be worked out privately. Dad would know I was serious about protecting Emma from his negligence. The family court hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., and I arrived early with Attorney Martinez. Dad showed up 20 minutes late with a public defender who'd clearly just met him that morning. He looked confused and angry, like he couldn't believe I'd actually taken legal action over what he still considered a minor misunderstanding. Judge Williams reviewed our evidence methodically. She examined the hospital records showing Emma's oxygen deprivation, listened to excerpts from my recorded conversations with Dad, and reviewed Jessica's social media posts about the incident. Dad's attorney tried to argue that this was a one-time mistake made by a grandfather who didn't understand medical equipment, but our documentation painted a different picture. When Dad took the stand to testify on his own behalf, he made every mistake Attorney Martinez had predicted he would make. He repeatedly referred to Emma's life support equipment as unnecessary and claimed the doctors were being overly cautious about her condition. He actually told the judge that modern parents were too anxious about childhood illnesses and that babies had survived for centuries without electronic monitoring. The moment that sealed his fate was when Judge Williams asked him directly whether he understood that Emma could have died if her breathing had stopped for much longer. Dad's response was, "Well, Maya found her pretty quickly, so it all worked out fine." Judge Williams' expression grew stern. "Mr. Rodriguez, you seem to fundamentally misunderstand the severity of what occurred. This child was medically compromised due to your decision to disconnect her life support equipment. The fact that permanent harm was avoided doesn't minimize the endangerment that took place." She granted my restraining order immediately, prohibiting Dad from coming within 500 feet of Emma, my home, or Emma's medical facilities. The order would remain in effect for 6 months, with the possibility of extension if Dad violated its terms or if I could demonstrate ongoing risk to Emma's safety. As we left the courthouse, Dad tried to approach me in the parking lot, but Attorney Martinez reminded him that the restraining order was now in effect. He shouted after me that I was destroying the family over nothing and that I'd regret cutting him out of Emma's life. That afternoon, I called Child Protective Services to file an official report about the oxygen monitor incident. The caseworker, Linda Thompson, scheduled a home visit for the following week to assess Emma's living situation and review the safety protocols I had in place. She explained that they would also need to interview Dad as part of their investigation, which would create a permanent record of the endangerment incident. Cases involving medical equipment tampering are taken very seriously by our department, Linda explained. Even if your father claims it was accidental, the fact that he disconnected life support equipment demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding about your daughter's medical needs. Within 48 hours of the court hearing, I'd successfully established legal boundaries to protect Emma and created an official government record of Dad's dangerous behavior. But this was just the beginning of my revenge plan. With the legal protections in place for Emma, I turned my attention to the financial evidence I'd been gathering against Dad. Working with Attorney Chen, I'd compiled a comprehensive report detailing Dad's suspicious spending patterns and Jessica's lifestyle that seemed far beyond what his legitimate income could support. The breakthrough came when I managed to get a copy of Jessica's credit card statements. She'd left her purse at Dad's house during one of her visits. And while looking for her car keys, I'd photographed several monthly statements that had arrived in Dad's mail. The credit card was issued by Dad's employer, Pinnacle Construction, and was supposed to be for business expenses only. Jessica's statements showed charges at luxury boutiques, expensive restaurants, spa treatments, and even her spring break vacation to Cabo. The total monthly spending was often more than Dad's entire take-home salary, and every charge was being paid automatically by Pinnacle Construction's accounting department. Attorney Chen helped me research Pinnacle Construction's employee policies, which I found on their corporate website. Company credit cards were strictly prohibited for personal use, and employees were required to submit detailed receipts and justifications for all business expenses. The policy explicitly stated that personal use of company cards was grounds for immediate termination and criminal prosecution. I also discovered that Dad had been submitting fake expense reports to justify Jessica's charges. A spa day in Jessica's Instagram posts was reported as a client entertainment expense. Her designer shopping sprees were categorized as professional development or business attire. Her Cabo vacation had been split across multiple expense categories including training conference, networking events, and client meetings. The most damning evidence was a company credit card that had been issued directly to Jessica, using Dad's employee credentials, but with her name on the account. This meant Dad had essentially created a phantom employee account for his daughter, allowing her unlimited access to company funds while making it appear legitimate in the accounting system. Attorney Chen explained that this level of financial fraud could result in felony charges carrying significant prison time. "Your father hasn't just been padding his expense account," he said. "He's created an elaborate scheme to systematically steal from his employer while documenting false justifications. This is sophisticated white-collar crime." I spent a weekend organizing all the evidence into a detailed report that Attorney Chen helped me prepare. We included Jessica's credit card statements, her social media posts showing expensive purchases with timestamps, Dad's falsified expense reports that I'd obtained through my banking friends' connections, and a financial analysis showing that Jessica's lifestyle required at least 3 times Dad's legitimate salary. The report also included the context of Dad's claims about being unable to help with Emma's medical expenses. We documented specific instances where Dad had told me he couldn't afford to help with Emma's treatments while simultaneously funding Jessica's luxury spending sprees. On a Tuesday morning, I submitted the fraud report to Pinnacle Construction's corporate compliance department through their anonymous whistleblower hotline. Attorney Chen had advised me to include enough specific details to make the investigation serious while protecting my identity as the source of the information. The report detailed Dad's position in the accounting department, the suspicious credit card accounts, specific expense categories being abused, and approximate dollar amounts of fraudulent charges. I also included Jessica's full name and the fact that she was Dad's daughter, making it clear that this was nepotism-based embezzlement rather than a random accounting error. Within a week, I received a callback from Pinnacle's internal investigation team. They wouldn't discuss details of their investigation, but they confirmed they were taking the matter seriously and had begun a comprehensive audit of the accounting department's expense accounts. I also sent copies of my evidence to the local district attorney's office, since Attorney Chen explained that criminal charges would need to be filed by prosecutors rather than the company. The DA's white-collar crime unit scheduled a meeting with me for the following month to review the evidence and determine whether to pursue criminal charges. Dad had no idea that his comfortable life was about to collapse completely. While waiting for the financial investigations to unfold, I decided it was time to control the narrative that Jessica had been spinning on social media. For weeks, she'd been portraying herself as the victim of a dramatic sister who was tearing the family apart over minor baby health concerns. Her followers had been sending her sympathy messages and validating her version of events, which only encouraged her narcissistic behavior. I spent several days crafting a detailed social media post that would expose the truth about what had happened to Emma. I included photos from Emma's NICU stay, documentation of her medical equipment, and hospital records showing the oxygen deprivation episode she'd suffered after Dad unplugged her monitor. I made sure to blur out any private medical information while still clearly showing the severity of Emma's condition. The post began with a photo of Emma in her hospital bed, surrounded by machines, with the caption, "This is my daughter Emma, born at 28 weeks, weighing 2 pounds. 3 weeks ago, my father unplugged her oxygen monitor to charge my sister's phone, causing Emma to stop breathing and suffer brain damage. While Emma fought for her life in the NICU, my sister posted Instagram stories complaining about being bored at the hospital." I included screenshots of Jessica's social media posts from the hospital, where she'd been taking selfies and complaining about the dramatic family situation. I also included excerpts from my recorded conversations where Dad dismissed Emma's medical needs and called me paranoid for following doctor's orders. The most powerful part of the post was a side-by-side comparison. Jessica's Instagram story about her expensive spring break vacation, posted the same week she claimed the family was under financial stress, next to a photo of Emma's medical bills that Dad claimed he couldn't help pay. I tagged Jessica and Dad in the post, along with several mutual family friends and relatives who had been following Jessica's version of events. I also used hashtags related to preemie awareness, medical negligence, and family accountability to reach a broader audience of parents who would understand the gravity of what had happened. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, my post had been shared hundreds of times by other parents, NICU families, and medical professionals who were horrified by Dad's actions. The comments section filled with supportive messages from people sharing their own preemie experiences and expressing outrage at Dad and Jessica's behavior. Several of Jessica's college friends and social media followers began questioning her previous posts about the family drama. They started commenting on her old posts asking why she hadn't mentioned that her niece was a micro-preemie on life support, or why she'd been posting about expensive vacations while claiming the family was stressed about medical bills. Jessica's response was predictably narcissistic. Instead of acknowledging the harm that had been done to Emma, she posted a defensive Instagram story claiming that I was cyberbullying her and trying to destroy her reputation with exaggerated stories. She insisted that Emma's breathing episode had been minor and that I was using social media to attack her unfairly. But Jessica's defensive posts only made things worse for her. Her followers could see the contrast between her trivial complaints about being inconvenienced by Emma's medical emergency and the reality of a premature baby fighting for her life. Many people began unfollowing her accounts and calling out her selfish behavior in the comments. Dad tried to get several family members to contact me about taking down the post, claiming it was hurting Jessica's reputation and future opportunities. He sent me angry text messages saying I was airing family business inappropriately and damaging relationships that could never be repaired. I responded to his texts with a simple message: Emma's safety is more important than Jessica's reputation. The truth needed to come out. The social media exposure achieved exactly what I'd hoped for. It corrected the false narrative Jessica had been spreading, educated people about the reality of preemie medical needs, and created social consequences for both Dad and Jessica's callous behavior toward Emma. The fallout from my social media post was swift and far-reaching, but it was nothing compared to what happened when Pinnacle Construction completed their internal investigation. 3 weeks after I'd submitted my fraud report, Dad received a call at work asking him to come to the main office for a meeting with Human Resources and the company's legal department. I found out what happened from my friend Kelly, whose bank had connections with Pinnacle's accounting firm. The company had discovered over $80,000 in fraudulent charges across multiple credit card accounts that Dad had been managing. The fake expense reports he'd submitted to justify Jessica's spending had been so obviously fabricated that the investigation took less than 2 weeks to complete. Dad was terminated immediately and escorted from the building by security. Pinnacle Construction also filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office, providing all the evidence from their internal investigation. The company's CEO issued a statement to employees emphasizing their zero-tolerance policy for fraud and their commitment to prosecuting financial crimes to the fullest extent of the law. Jessica found out about Dad's termination when her credit cards were suddenly declined during a shopping trip with her sorority sisters. The company had canceled all accounts associated with Dad's employee credentials, leaving Jessica stranded at an expensive boutique with a cart full of designer clothes she couldn't afford. She called Dad in a panic, and he had to explain that he'd been fired for accounting irregularities. Jessica's immediate response, according to the voicemail she left me, was to ask how this would affect her tuition payments and summer plans. Even facing the collapse of her financial support system, her first concern was how it would inconvenience her personally. The criminal charges came next. The district attorney's office filed multiple felony counts against Dad, including embezzlement, fraud, and falsifying business records. The total amount of stolen funds exceeded the threshold for serious felony charges, meaning Dad was facing potential prison time rather than just fines or probation. Jessica's college situation unraveled quickly once Dad could no longer make tuition payments. The expensive private university she attended required payment in full before each semester, and Dad had been funding her education entirely through his embezzled money. When the spring semester payment bounced, the university placed a hold on Jessica's account and began the process of withdrawing her enrollment. Jessica tried desperately to get financial aid or student loans, but her previous years of non-payment meant she owed the university nearly $60,000 in back tuition that Dad had been covering with stolen funds. The financial aid office explained that she'd need to settle her outstanding balance before they could process any new aid applications. Dad's legal troubles became public record when the local newspaper picked up the story about Pinnacle Construction's embezzlement case. The article detailed Dad's position in the company, the amount of money stolen, and the fact that he'd been using company funds to support his daughter's lavish lifestyle. Several of Dad's co-workers were quoted anonymously expressing shock that someone they'd trusted with company finances had been systematically stealing for years. The newspaper article was shared extensively on social media, connecting back to my original post about Emma's medical emergency. People began putting together the full picture. Dad had claimed he couldn't afford to help with his granddaughter's medical bills while simultaneously stealing thousands of dollars to fund his other daughter's shopping sprees and vacation expenses. Jessica's remaining social media followers turned completely against her once they understood that her entire lifestyle had been funded through embezzled money. Her Instagram comments filled with accusations of being a spoiled criminal who had benefited from stolen funds while her infant niece struggled with medical bills. Both Dad and Jessica had lost everything that mattered to them. Dad faced years in prison and would never work in accounting again. Jessica lost her education, her financial support, and her social media platform that had been so important to her identity. But I wasn't finished with them yet. The biggest revelation was still coming. The final piece of my revenge came not from anything I had planned, but from a discovery I made while going through old family documents for my attorney. I was looking for Dad's employment history to help with the criminal case when I found a box of papers in Mom's old desk that I'd never seen before. Inside were documents that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. There was a birth certificate showing that I was born 6 months before my parents' wedding date, along with letters between Mom and a man named David Chen, not my attorney, but someone with the same name who had apparently been Mom's boyfriend before she met Dad. The letters told a story I'd never heard. Mom had been pregnant with me when she met Dad, and Dad had agreed to marry her and raise me as his own child. But the real shock was a DNA test result from when I was 3 years old, confirming that Dad was not my biological father. According to the letters, my real father, David, had been a married man who couldn't leave his wife, and Mom had decided to build a new life with Dad instead. Dad had known from the beginning that I wasn't his biological child, but he'd promised to love me as his own daughter. The final document in the box was a letter Mom had written but never sent, dated just before she died in a car accident when I was 12. In it, she expressed guilt about the family dynamics and how Dad had started favoring Jessica after she was born. Mom worried that Dad was overcompensating for his lack of biological connection to me by pouring all his affection into his real daughter. Everything suddenly made sense. Dad's favoritism toward Jessica wasn't just random preference. It was rooted in the fact that she was his biological child, while I was the product of another man's relationship with Mom. Jessica's golden child status, Dad's dismissive treatment of my needs, and his willingness to endanger Emma all stemmed from his fundamental belief that Jessica was his real family, while Emma and I were obligations he'd inherited. But here's the twist that made my revenge even more satisfying. Jessica had no idea about any of this. She'd grown up believing she was simply Dad's favorite, never knowing that her privileged position came from being his only biological child. I decided to reveal this information at Dad's sentencing hearing, where family members were allowed to give victim impact statements. With Attorney Martinez's help, I prepared a statement that included the family history along with the impact of Dad's crimes on Emma's medical care. Standing in front of the packed courtroom, I read the DNA test results aloud and explained how Dad's guilt about not being my biological father had led him to embezzle money to spoil Jessica while claiming he couldn't afford to help with Emma's medical bills. Jessica, who had come to the hearing to support Dad, turned pale as she realized that her entire identity as the beloved daughter had been based on a secret she'd never known. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people understood that Dad's financial crimes were motivated not just by greed, but by a dysfunctional attempt to compensate for family secrets. Dad's face crumpled as I revealed the documents Mom had hidden for years. He'd spent decades overcompensating for his guilt about raising another man's child, and that overcompensation had ultimately led to his criminal behavior and the endangerment of his granddaughter. The judge sentenced Dad to 4 years in prison and ordered him to pay full restitution to Pinnacle Construction. In her sentencing remarks, she noted that Dad's crimes had been particularly egregious because he'd prioritized funding one child's luxuries over ensuring medical care for his vulnerable granddaughter. As we left the courthouse, Jessica approached me one final time, but instead of apologizing for her behavior toward Emma, she asked me if I'd known about the DNA test all along and whether I'd used it to manipulate the legal case against Dad. Even facing the truth about our family's dysfunction, Jessica still couldn't accept responsibility for the harm she'd caused. 6 months later, Emma had her first birthday party. She was thriving, meeting all her developmental milestones, and no longer needed most of her medical equipment. As I watched her take her first wobbly steps across our living room, surrounded by friends who genuinely cared about her well-being, I realized something profound had shifted. The little girl who had spent years begging for Dad's approval was gone. The woman who had once desperately wanted to belong in a family that never valued her had discovered something more powerful: the ability to create her own family based on love and protection, rather than obligation and guilt. Marcus handed me a card that had arrived that morning. It was from Dad, writing from prison, asking if he could see Emma when he got out. For the first time in my life, I held all the power in our relationship. He needed something from me, and I got to decide whether he deserved it. I tore up the letter without reading the rest. Emma deserved better than people who would endanger her for convenience. And finally, so did I. The scared little girl seeking approval had become the fierce mother who would burn down anyone who threatened her child. That's the most satisfying revenge of all. This story may have ended, but the message lingers. For more raw and real moments like this, click on the left and subscribe to walk alongside more women finding their strength. Healing takes time, but it's possible.